She heard the shears before she felt them, the soft mechanical whisper of the blades sliding together, once, twice, 3 times, and then the cold weight of her hair was gone, and the night air touched the back of her neck like a stranger's hand. Elara Voss did not scream. She had long since learned that screaming in this house earned nothing but locked doors and skipped meals. She sat very still on the low stool in her stepmother's dressing room, her spine rigid, her hands pressed flat against her thighs, and she breathed, in and out, steady. While Lady Mirabel Voss circled her like a cat inspecting a broken bird, and the maid, pale, trembling, hating herself for it, gathered the severed lengths of dark hair from the floor. "There," Lady Mirabel said, not cruelly. That was the worst of it. She said it the way one might say there after straightening a crooked painting, with the mild satisfaction of a problem solved. "You were going to outshine Cecily at her own presentation. You understand that, don't you? A mother's first duty is to her daughter." Elara said nothing. "You have your mother's hair." Lady Mirabel set the shears on her dressing table, among the perfume bottles and the pearl-handled brushes that had once belonged to Elara's mother. It was rather too much. Drawing attention you have no right to draw. In the mirror, Elara watched her own reflection and barely recognized the woman looking back. The face was the same, gray-green eyes, the scattering of freckles her mother had called a constellation, the stubborn set of her jaw that apparently no amount of breaking had managed to change. But the frame was destroyed. Her hair, dark and thick, grown past her shoulders through 14 years of her mother's careful tending, now ended in ragged tufts just below her ears. The cut was uneven, deliberate in its ugliness. "You'll still attend tomorrow," Lady Mirabel said, turning back to her own reflection in the mirror. "It would look strange if you didn't. But you'll stay near the refreshment table, and you won't dance, and you won't put yourself forward. You'll be grateful, Elara, that I allow you to come at all." If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She was dismissed with a look. Elara rose from the stool, walked to a room at the end of the east corridor, the smallest room, the one that leaked when it rained, the one that had once been used to store spare furniture before they had moved the furniture out and moved her in. And she sat on the edge of her narrow bed and looked at her hands in the dark. She did not cry. She had cried herself empty 3 years ago, the autumn her father died, and somewhere, in those months of silent grief, she had discovered that tears cost something she could not afford. Every drop of sorrow spent on this house, on this life, on Lady Mirabel's careful cruelties, was a drop stolen from the reservoir of strength she needed to survive until she could escape. She would escape. She had no plan, no means, no useful connections, but she had the absolute certainty of someone who has understood, finally and without illusion, that remaining still means dying by degrees. She would escape this house, this life, this slow erasure of everything she had once been. She only needed an opportunity. She did not know, sitting in the dark with her ruined hair and her father's absence pressing down on her like weather, that the opportunity was already traveling toward her on the road from London, that it would have dark eyes and a reputation like a storm warning, and that it would find her, of all places, crouching behind a yew hedge in the Whitmore garden, trying very hard not to cry. Elara's father had been a practical man with an impractical heart. Edmund Voss, second son of a respectable family, had built a modest fortune through careful land management and even more careful investments. He had married Elara's mother, Clara. For love rather than advantage, a decision his family had never forgiven and he had never regretted. They had been happy, the three of them, in Voss Manor with its overgrown gardens and its comfortable rooms and its persistent smell of wood smoke and the particular brand of quiet contentment that comes from people who actually like each other. Clara died of a fever when Elara was 11. Edmund spent 3 years becoming the shadow of himself, going through the motions of estate management, correspondence, meals at the proper hours. Then, Lady Mirabel Ashby arrived at a neighbor's dinner party, and Edmund, grief-softened and lonely, had seen a composed, elegant widow and thought, perhaps companionship is not betrayal. He was wrong about Mirabel. He was wrong about many things in those years. They clouded as he was by grief and the desperate human need to not be alone. By the time he understood the woman he had married, her calculations, her coldness, the way she treated Elara like a structural flaw in an otherwise acceptable property, he was already ill. He spent his last year apologizing to Elara with his eyes across dinner tables he no longer had the strength to properly manage, and he died in the early autumn before he had found a way to say the words aloud. He left everything to his wife, as was customary, with a modest allowance designated for Elara. The allowance had not materialized in the 2 years since. When Elara had raised the matter once, quietly, carefully, by choosing her moment, Lady Mirabel had looked at her with that particular expression she reserved for objects she found distasteful and said, "The estate's debts are considerable. I'm sure your father intended the allowance to be contingent on solvency. Now, have you finished the accounts for the month? I need them by Thursday." So that was the shape of her life. The accounts on Thursday, the meals in the kitchen, the small bedroom with its drafty window, the borrowed dresses that were always slightly wrong, too long, too wide, too old in their fashion. And Cecily, Lady Mirabel's daughter from her first marriage, golden and oblivious and genuinely kind in the way of people who have never had to think about their own survival, moving through the house like sunlight through a room Elara was no longer allowed to occupy. But Cecily was not the enemy. That was the complicated truth Elara returned to again and again. Cecily didn't know or didn't want to know, or knew and was powerless in her own way. She had slipped a hair ribbon under Elara's door once, after the incident with the evening gown. She had once, only once, said to her mother in Elara's hearing, "You might be kinder to her." The look Lady Mirabel had given her daughter had ended that particular experiment in compassion. Tomorrow was Cecily's presentation at the Whitmore summer ball. Lady Mirabel had been planning it for months, the gown, the jewels, the careful positioning of Cecily before the right men. The Whitmore Ball was the social event of this part of the county, drawing families from 3 surrounding shires, and this year it was drawing someone else as well. Elara had heard the name in snatches, the way she heard most things in this house, through half-open doors, around corners, in the gaps between what she was told and what was true. The Duke of Raven Hollow was coming to the Whitmore Ball. His name was Cian Aldric, and he was 29 years old, and he had inherited his title at 26 when his father fell from a horse on a hunting morning. Society called him cold, his aunt called him lost, his tenants called him fair, which was the highest praise the people who actually knew him were willing to offer. He had been in London for 3 years, conducting himself with the precise, efficient competence of a man who has decided that duty is the only thing left worth doing. He had declined every match presented to him. He had attended few social events. He had, by most accounts, not stopped laughing entirely after his father's death, or if he laughed, no one in London had been present to witness it. He was coming to the Whitmore Ball at the insistence of his aunt, Lady Greta Aldric, who had issued him what Elara gathered was an ultimatum of some kind. The county whispered about possible courtship. Lady Mirabel had spent 3 evenings calculating angles. None of this touched Elara directly. She had been told clearly enough. Refreshment table, no dancing, don't put yourself forward. She was to be present and invisible, a contradiction in terms that Lady Mirabel achieved by treating her stepdaughter as furniture. She had not expected to care about the Duke of Raven Hollow at all. She had not expected to meet him crouching behind a hedge. The Whitmore Ball began at 7, and by 7:30 the house was blazing with light and noise and the particular overheated festivity of a social event that has been anticipated too long. Elara arrived at the refreshment table as instructed, collected a glass of lemonade she didn't want, and stood very quietly beside a potted palm while Cecily was introduced to the assembled families, and Lady Mirabel worked the room with the focused efficiency of a general executing a campaign. The evening unfolded around her like a play she was watching through glass. Couples formed for dancing, gentlemen were presented, the Whitmore daughters sparkled in their new gowns. Cecily was beautiful and gracious and received a great deal of attention, some of which was genuine and some of which was clearly directed at Lady Mirabel through her daughter, And because Lady Mirabel had that effect on rooms, people aimed things at her, approval and fear and social positioning, like flowers tracking a very cold sun. No one looked at Elara. This was not new. This was, in fact, the expected condition of her life. But tonight it sat differently, the cut ends of her hair brushing against her jaw with every movement, a constant small reminder of what had been done, of what she had allowed to be done because she had nowhere else to go. She pressed her father's pocket watch in her hand. She still had it. Lady Mirabel had tried to take it twice, and twice Elara had simply quietly moved it somewhere else. It was the one thing she had managed to keep. His initials were worn into the gold case, E.V., and inside the cover was her mother's portrait, small enough to fit in a locket, painted in the first year of their marriage when Clara had still had that particular brightness that happiness gives to faces. She held the watch very tightly and watched the dancing and did not feel sorry for herself, which took considerable effort. At 10 minutes past 8, something changed in the room. She noticed it first as a shift in the direction of attention, heads turning, fans pausing mid-flutter, conversations faltering. Then the whispers, traveling through the assembled company like a current through water. He's here. He came after all. There, near the door. That's him, the Duke of Raven Hollow. Elara looked, because she was human, and because curiosity is one of the things that grief and servitude cannot entirely kill. He was tall. That was her first impression, and not a useful one. Men of his class were often tall, fed well from birth and unbent by labor. But there was something in the way he stood, in the particular stillness of him amid the room's constant motion, that made height beside the point. He wore dark evening clothes with the unconscious ease of someone who has never had to think about whether he belongs in a room, and his face, she could see it from here, even across the crowded ballroom, was the kind of face that seemed carved rather than grown, all sharp planes and shadows, a jaw like a sentence that doesn't apologize for itself, and eyes, even from this distance, that seemed to be doing the opposite of what everyone else's were doing, not performing observation, actually observing. He was introduced to the Whitmore family. He was civil, precise, giving nothing unnecessary. His aunt, a small woman in green silk, with sharp, but kind eyes, stood beside him and appeared to be conducting a running commentary he was politely ignoring. Lady Mirabel began her approach within minutes. Elara watched it with the detached expertise of someone who has observed this particular maneuver many times, the drift across the room that managed to look accidental, the positioning near the Duke's circle until an introduction became socially inevitable, the smooth presentation of Cecily, luminous in ivory silk, her golden hair arranged in elaborate perfection. Cecily curtsied. The Duke inclined his head. Lady Mirabel said something that made the Whitmore matriarch laugh. Elara looked away. She had seen enough. She needed air. The ballroom was insufferably warm, and the lemonade had done nothing to help. And she had been standing beside a potted palm for over an hour, performing the particular feat of invisible endurance that had become her primary skill. She set her glass down, checked that no one was watching her, no one ever was, and slipped through the side door that led to the terrace. The night air was a mercy, cool and dark, carrying the smell of the Whitmore gardens, roses and damp grass and the faint green sharpness of the yew hedges that bordered the formal walk. The terrace was lit with lanterns, but beyond it, the garden fell into the comfortable dark of a summer night, and Elara moved toward the darkness instinctively, the way she always moved toward whatever was quietest and least observed. She made it perhaps 30 feet into the garden before the sound of the terrace door opening behind her made her stop. Footsteps. Male. Unhurried, the particular quality of step that comes from someone who is not fleeing anything but walking with deliberate purpose. She stepped sideways off the gravel path and pressed herself into the shadow of the nearest yew hedge, and waited, and breathed. The footsteps paused near the beginning of the walk. Silence. Then, "I know you're there." The voice was quiet, precise, and carried without effort, the voice of someone accustomed to being heard without raising it, low, with an edge that was not quite coldness, but adjacent to it, the way the hour before dawn is not quite dark but is not yet light. Elara stayed very still for one more moment. Then she stepped out from behind the hedge. He was closer than she had expected. 10 feet, perhaps less. He stood in the lantern light that spilled from the terrace, and in this closer proximity his face was different from across the ballroom. Younger, somehow, in a way that the formal distance of a crowded room had concealed. The sharpness was still there, but beneath it, or behind it, she sensed something else. A tiredness that ran too deep for a single evening's social obligation. The particular exhaustion of someone who has been performing a version of themselves for a very long time. He was looking at her with an expression that gave nothing away. His eyes moved over her the way she had watched him survey the ballroom, not assessing for advantage as Lady Mirabel's eyes did, but actually looking, as if he expected to find something true. "You are not enjoying the ball," he said. It was not a question. "I rarely enjoy crowds," Elara said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. "Though I find the garden preferable." "As do I." He glanced back toward the house, where music and conversation spilled from the bright windows. "I've been told I'm expected to find one of those crowds enjoyable." "By your aunt, I imagine." His eyes returned to her with something sharper. "You know who I am. Everyone knows who you are. You're the evening's guest of honor, the Duke of Raven Hollow." She paused. "You were being introduced to a woman in ivory silk just before I left." "I was." Something shifted in his expression, so briefly she might have imagined it. "She was very beautiful. She is. She's also completely terrified, though she hides it well. She doesn't want to marry a duke any more than she wants to sail to the Americas. But she's been preparing for this introduction for 3 months because her mother has decided it will happen." He studied her. "You know her. She's my sister." The word felt wrong in her mouth. "My stepsister. And you are—" He stopped. His gaze had moved with that same clinical attention to her hair. In the lantern light, the ragged unevenness was visible, she knew, the uneven line where the shears had worked quickly and without care. Elara kept her chin level. Let him look. She had stopped pretending, somewhere between the dressing room and this garden, that pretending cost her anything she couldn't afford to lose. "Someone cut your hair," he said. "My stepmother, last night." His expression did not change, but something happened behind his eyes. A gathering, like weather. "Before the ball. Before Cecily's presentation. And I was going to draw attention." The words came out without bitterness. She had learned that bitterness was a luxury, that it cost more than it gave. Lady Mirabel is thorough. The Duke of Raven Hollow was quiet for a moment. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite name, and she realized, with a start that moved through her like cold water, that he was angry. Not in the way she had seen men be angry, theatrical, loud, performing their fury for an audience. This was the other kind. The kind that goes very still and very quiet, and chooses its moment. "That," he said finally, "is not something a mother does." "She's not my mother." Elara tucked a strand of the ruined hair behind her ear. "My mother has been dead for 7 years." "And your father?" 2 years. He looked at her for a long moment in the dark garden. Was this man who was supposedly cold, who society said had stopped feeling things, whose face was carved and unreadable? Then he said, very quietly, the words she had not expected from anyone, least of all a duke she had met 4 minutes ago in the dark. "I'm sorry." Not the social sorry. Not the reflexive sorry of someone performing sympathy. The 2-syllable sorry of someone who has lost people and knows what the ledger of loss actually costs. Elara opened her mouth and found to her profound alarm that she had nothing to say. "Will you walk with me?" he asked. "The garden appears to continue beyond the hedge. I find I would rather keep walking than return to that room." She should refuse. She should cite propriety and her stepmother's instructions and the dozen reasons a woman in her position had no business walking alone in a garden with a duke she had just met. She should go back to the refreshment table and the potted palm and the careful invisibility that was her protection and her prison. Instead, she said, "The walk goes all the way to the old wall. There's a gate, but it's been rusted shut for years. The roses near the end are very fine." He offered his arm. She took it. and they walked together into the dark garden, away from the music and the lanterns and the bright social machinery of the ball, while the night settled around them like something that had been waiting. She would remember afterward that she had not meant to talk. She had meant to walk in polite silence, to answer his questions if he asked any, to get through the encounter without humiliating herself further. She had not meant to tell him about her father's watch. She had not meant to describe the afternoon she had found her mother's handwriting on a letter tucked inside a book Lady Mirabel had tried to discard. She had certainly not meant to tell him about the ledger she kept, the private one, the real accounts, not the household accounts she managed for Lady Mirabel, but the small, careful record she kept of everything her father had left her in spirit if not in law, the debts against her, the balance she was trying, year by year, to find a way to claim. But he asked, and his questions were the kind that assumed she had something worth saying, and it had been a very long time since anyone had made that assumption. He said little himself. He walked beside her and listened, and occasionally said something precise and true that made her stop mid-sentence and look at him. He had a way of cutting to the center of things, not cruelly, but with the directness of someone who found the long route wasteful. When she told him about the accounts, he asked to understand the structure of the problem. When she described Lady Mirabel's management of the estate, he said without inflection, "She's spending the principal. The estate will be insolvent within 3 years." "I know," Elara said. "I've been trying to determine if there's any legal avenue through my father's original will." "Are there copies?" "One. I have it, hidden." He looked at her then, and something in his expression shifted, something she couldn't quite read, some recalibration happening behind the controlled surface of his face. "You're very methodical," he said, "for someone who's been stripped of every resource." "My mother taught me to be precise." She touched the watch in her pocket. "She said that clarity was a form of courage, that knowing exactly where you stand, even when where you stand is terrible, is better than comforting yourself with fog." The Duke was quiet for a moment. They had reached the old wall, its stones dark with age, the rusted gate a shadow at its center. The roses Lady Mirabel had no interest in managing grew wild here, spilling over the stones in cascades of pale pink and deep red, their scent thick in the warm night air. "My father said something similar," he said. "He called it the discipline of clear sight." A pause. "I haven't thought about that phrase in a long time." She looked at him in the dark garden. This man who society said had stopped feeling things, whose title preceded him like a warning, whose eyes had been watching her all evening with the particular attention of someone who is searching for something true. He looked, in this moment, beside this wall with its wild roses, like a man who was standing at the edge of something he had been avoiding for a very long time. "Your father," she said carefully, "you lost him as well. 3 years ago." "I'm sorry," she said. The same 2 words, the same weight. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, the corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile exactly, but the precursor to one, the ghost of the expression, there and gone, like a light glimpsed through a closing door. "Miss Voss," he said. He had asked her name, somewhere on the walk, and she had given it. "I came to this ball intending to spend 1 hour before finding a legitimate excuse to return to London. And instead I have spent," he glanced upward briefly, calculating, "nearly 40 minutes discussing estate law and Elara Voss's philosophy of clear sight with a woman hiding behind a yew hedge. I wasn't hiding," she paused. "I was standing quietly in the shadow of a hedge. The distinction is subtle. The distinction is everything." He looked at her again. That gathering thing was back in his expression, that sense of weather accumulating. He opened his mouth. Then, from the direction of the house, a voice cut through the garden. "Elara," Cecily's voice, soft and urgent. "Are you out here? Mama is—" Cecily appeared at the terrace's edge and stopped. In the soft light that fell from the house, Elara watched her stepsister take in the scene before her. Elara and the Duke of Raven Hollow, standing together at the far end of the garden walk, close enough to have been in conversation, which they had been for nearly an hour, which Cecily's expression made clear was not a circumstance Lady Mirabel had anticipated. The Duke turned to face the house, His expression had closed again, the brief openness sealed shut, but something remained in his eyes that hadn't been there before. A question, or perhaps the beginning of an answer. "I believe," he said, quietly enough that only Elara could hear, "that we have been discovered." "I believe so." He offered his arm with impersonal courtesy for the walk back. She took it. And as they moved toward the house, toward the light and the music and Lady Mirabel's fury waiting somewhere in the glittering rooms, Elara pressed her father's watch through the silk of her pocket and understood with the clarity her mother had always prized that something had changed tonight. She did not yet know what to call it, but she knew, with the same precision that told her the estate would be insolvent in 3 years, and that the copy of the will was safely hidden, that the Duke of Ravenhollow had looked at her, had seen her clearly without the charitable squinting that passed for most people's attention, and had not looked away. She did not know what that meant. She suspected she was about to find out. Lady Mirabel did not rage. That was the thing about her that Elara had taken the longest to understand, and the thing that made her most dangerous. Lesser women raged. Lady Mirabel simply became very still and very pleasant, the way a deep river is pleasant, smooth on the surface, with the current doing its work entirely out of sight. She said nothing on the carriage ride home. She sat across from Elara with her hands folded in her lap, and her face arranged in an expression of mild contentment, while Cecily stared at the window and said nothing, and the darkness outside rushed past, and Elara pressed herself into the corner of the seat and waited for whatever was coming. It came the next morning, before breakfast. Lady Mirabel sent for her at 7, which was an hour earlier than the household usually stirred, and Elara came to the morning room in her plain gray dress to find her stepmother already seated, tea poured, expression composed. "Sit down." Elara sat. "I will say this once." Lady Mirabel lifted her teacup with the deliberate grace of someone who has decided exactly how this conversation will go. "What happened last night was an accident. You wandered into the garden. Understandable. You've always been difficult in crowds. And the Duke happened to find you there. Society will interpret it that way if it is handled correctly. If you are appropriately modest, if you do not encourage further association." She paused. "If you understand what encouraging further association would cost this family." "I understand," Elara said. "Do you?" Lady Mirabel set her cup down. "He came here to meet Cecily. Cecily is the appropriate match. Cecily has the manners and the connections and the—" She paused, the pause itself a kind of cruelty, the presentation required. "Whatever the Duke may have found momentarily diverting about you last night, it was a diversion. Men of his position do not marry diversions. They marry appropriately, and you will not complicate that process." "I have no intention of complicating anything," Elara said. "Good." Lady Mirabel rose. "Then we understand each other." They did. They always had. The understanding between them was perfect and terrible, each aware of exactly what the other knew, what the other wanted, what the other was capable of. Elara understood that Lady Mirabel would destroy her socially, financially, and in every other available dimension, if she believed her stepdaughter to be a genuine obstacle. Thus Lady Mirabel understood that Elara had survived every previous attempt at destruction, and was therefore a variable that required management rather than simply disposal. They were two people who could not afford to underestimate each other, and who never did. Elara returned to her room, sat at her small desk, and opened the household accounts ledger. The familiar columns of numbers steadied her. They always had. Numbers did not perform. Numbers did not manage you. Numbers simply were what they were, and if you were precise and clear-sighted, as her mother had taught her, you could always find the truth in them. She was still working when the letter arrived. It came with the morning post, addressed to her in a handwriting she did not recognize, angular and precise. The letters formed with the same quality of controlled intention she had noticed in everything else about the Duke of Ravenhollow. The seal was plain wax, no crest. Deliberate, she thought, deliberate in its discretion. She read it quickly, then read it again. "Miss Voss, my aunt, Lady Greta Aldric, will be calling on the Whitmore family this afternoon on a matter of social courtesy. She has expressed a wish to make the acquaintance of the Voss family as well, should they be available to receive." I am told she is very fond of roses, and understands that the gardens at Voss Manor are particularly fine at this time of year. I will accompany her. C.A. Elara held the letter for a long moment. Outside her window, the morning was already warm, and the kind of late summer warmth that felt like an argument against everything cold and carefully managed in her life. She thought of the Duke standing at the rusted gate in the dark garden, saying, "I'm sorry," in the voice of someone who meant it. She thought of Lady Mirabel at breakfast, cup in hand, telling her not to complicate things. She thought, "He is coming here." She thought, "I should find a reason to be elsewhere." She did not find a reason to be elsewhere. She was in the garden when the Aldric carriage rolled up the drive, on her knees beside the rose beds with her gloves dirty and her hair, ruined, still ruined, the ragged ends catching on the warm breeze, tucked as best she could behind her ears. She heard the carriage, heard the voices at the front of the house, heard Lady Mirabel's particular tone of gracious surprise, and she stayed where she was, partly because moving now would look like flight, mostly because she was not done with the aphids on the third bed, and the roses did not care who was visiting. She was aware of the moment he saw her. She couldn't have said how, some shift in the quality of the air, some peripheral change that her body registered before her mind did. She kept her hands in the soil. "The third bed is the oldest," she said without looking up. "My mother planted these roses the first spring after she married my father. Lady Mirabel finds them old-fashioned." A pause. Then footsteps on the gravel path, unhurried, and the Duke of Ravenhollow crouched beside her with the easy physical confidence of a man untroubled by dignity's performance. "She hasn't had them removed," he observed. "She tried once. The gardener, old Hartman, told her the roots were too deep and it would destroy the bed entirely. She decided the appearance of a rose garden was worth more than the inconvenience of these particular ones." Elara finally looked up. He was lying, of course. They could be removed. He simply understood that some things shouldn't be. The Duke was watching her with that quality of attention she had noted in the garden last night. Not assessment exactly, but something more particular than that, as though she were a text. He was reading carefully, checking his understanding at each line. "You defended the roses," he said. "Hartman defended the roses. I simply didn't correct him." A useful distinction. He looked at the bed, at the thick, tangled growth of it, the blooms opening in their impractical abundance. "They're very fine." "They are." She pulled her hands from the soil and stood, brushing the dirt from her gloves. "Your aunt is with Lady Mirabel?" "She is. She will keep Lady Mirabel occupied for some time. My aunt has a remarkable talent for extended social conversation when she judges it necessary." If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Elara looked at him steadily. "You arranged this visit." "I suggested it to my aunt. She agreed it had merit." "May I ask why?" He was quiet for a moment. He had picked up a fallen bloom from the path, dark red, on petals loosening at the edges, and turned it between his fingers with a kind of absent attention that she had already begun to recognize as the physical expression of him thinking something through. "Last night," he said, "you told me your father's estate is being systematically stripped. You told me you have a copy of his will hidden. You told me there may be legal avenues you haven't been able to pursue for lack of resources in council." He looked up. "I have resources in council." Elara felt something move through her chest, carefully, warily, the way you feel for the floor in a dark room. "You don't know me." "I knew your father." The words were quiet and landed with a weight she hadn't expected. "Edmund Voss was a member of the same agricultural society as my father. They corresponded for years. I have those letters still. My father kept everything." A pause. "Your father described you in one of them. He said, I remember this precisely because I read the letters again after my father died, looking for him in the pages. He said, 'My daughter Elara has her mother's way of seeing things clearly where others choose to see comfortably. It is the quality I am most proud of and most worried for, because the world is not always kind to clear sight.'" The morning was very still suddenly. The warmth of it pressed against her like something living. "He wrote that," she managed. "He did. 2 years before he died." Cian Aldric set the rose down carefully on the path's edge. "I don't know what your father intended for your future, but I know what he saw in you. And I find I am not interested in pretending last night's conversation didn't happen simply because it was inconvenient for the social calculations of others." Elara looked at this man, the Duke, the cold one, the one who had stopped feeling things, and thought about what it meant that he had ridden out here the morning after a ball with a careful, discreet letter and an aunt who could occupy Lady Mirabel for an extended social call. That was not a man who had found something momentarily diverting. That was a man conducting a deliberate operation. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked. "I'm proposing nothing yet. I'm proposing a conversation, today, and possibly again, with my aunt as chaperone in the social fiction that this is a courtesy call, nothing more." He met her eyes directly. "I want to understand the situation with your father's estate. I want to hear what's in that will, and I want to do it before Lady Mirabel has the opportunity to make you disappear again." It was that last phrase that undid her careful composure, not the offer of help. She had trained herself not to trust offers, which had protected her a good deal over the past 2 years. But the phrase, "make you disappear again," which meant he had noticed. He had looked at her life and seen the erasure happening in it, and called it by its name. "The will is in my room," she said, "hidden inside a copy of Cowper's poems on the 3rd shelf of the small bookcase. If I retrieve it now, while Lady Mirabel is occupied, we'll have perhaps 20 minutes before my absence from the house becomes notable." The Duke rose. 20 minutes is sufficient. I am, as it happens, very quick with documents." They sat at the iron garden table near the far wall, in the shade of the old ash tree, with the copy of Cowper's poems between them and Elara's father's will unfolded on the table's surface. Lady Greta Aldric's voice drifted from the house in warm, sustained social commentary. Lady Mirabel's replies were visible to a trained ear as the sound of a woman being managed with great skill. Cian read the will with the same precise attention he gave everything. He didn't speak while he read. He didn't ask clarifying questions. He simply moved through the document with a focus that reminded Elara of the way she felt when she was working through a difficult set of accounts, the complete narrowing of attention to the problem before her, everything else falling away. When he finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The allowance is unconditional," he said. "The language is clear. Lady Mirabel has no legitimate grounds to withhold it. She claims the estate debts override it. The debts are the estate's debts. The allowance is a specific bequest. They are legally distinct." He looked up. "She knows this. She's been counting on you not having access to proper legal advice. I haven't had access to anything proper for 2 years. He held her gaze. "You do now." He folded the will with careful hands and returned it to the poems. "My solicitor, Penhaligon, who is extremely good and does not frighten easily, will review this and write to Lady Mirabel's man of business within the fortnight. The allowance will be released within the month." Elara's hands were very still on the table's edge. You don't have to. Your father was my father's friend." The words were simple, and he said them simply. "And what has been done to you is wrong. Those 2 facts are sufficient." She looked at him across the table, this man whose society had decided was cold. She was beginning to understand that cold was the wrong word. Cold was absence. What he was contained, a great deal happening inside a very controlled exterior, like a house where all the shutters are closed, but lights are burning in every room. "Why didn't you come to your father's deathbed?" she asked. The question arrived without permission. She would have recalled it if she could, but it was already out. The thing she had been turning over since last night, since he had said I arrived too late, since she had seen for just a moment, are the particular expression of someone who has never forgiven themselves for something they could not control. He was very still. "I was in London," he said. "Parliamentary business. There was a vote, a land enclosure act that would have affected hundreds of tenant families. I believed it was necessary for me to be present." A pause that had years in it. "My father took ill suddenly. The message didn't reach me until the 2nd day. By the time I made London to a home, he had been gone for 6 hours. You couldn't have known. No, the word was flat. I've been told that. I tell it to myself. The logic of it is sound. The knowledge that I chose duty over presence when it mattered most is somewhat impervious to sound logic. You think you failed him. I know I failed him. He looked at the roses, not at her. He would have told me otherwise. He would have said the same things you're thinking right now, that I couldn't have known, that the choice was reasonable, that he would have made the same choice himself. He was a generous man. Something moved across his face. That's precisely why it's so difficult to forgive myself, because I know what he would have said, and I know I don't deserve it, and I know he would have given it to me anyway. Elara thought of her own father in the last months of his life, watching her across dinner tables with those apologetic eyes, the things he hadn't managed to say, the forgiveness she had given him anyway, because he was her father, because love is not always proportional to what is deserved. My father knew he was failing me, she said quietly. He watched Lady Mirabel manage me out of my own life, and he didn't have the strength left to stop it, and I think he spent the last year of his life drowning in that knowledge. She looked at the watch in her hand. She'd taken it out without thinking. I wasn't angry at him. I should have been, perhaps, but I couldn't be angry at him because I could see what the grief had done to him. I could see that he was already so far lost in his own sorrow that there was nothing left of him to fight with. And now? Now I hold his watch and his memory and the qualities he left me, and I use them to build a way out of the situation he couldn't protect me from. She said it plainly, without self-pity. That's not bitterness, it's just the truth of it. Cian looked at her steadily. How do you do that? He asked. The question was genuine, almost careful, the question of a man who has been trying to find an answer to something for a long time. Do what? Carry the grief without being crushed by it. You've lost the same things I've lost. Both parents, the life you were owed, the safety you should have had. And you are, he paused, the control in his voice fraying slightly at its edges, here, present, building accounts and hiding wills and defending rose beds. How are you not simply destroyed? She thought about the question seriously, because it deserved seriousness. I think I am, a little, she said at last, destroyed in places. There are parts of me that are much smaller than they used to be because something happened to them. My confidence in being cared for, my belief that people mean what they say. A pause. My hair. She touched the ragged ends with a dry half-smile that surprised her. But being destroyed in places is different from being destroyed entirely. And the parts that are still whole, the clear sight, my mother called it, those are the parts I've been protecting. Because those are the parts that will get me out. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something that was past the careful control, past the contained grief, past the 3 years of performing himself, something that was simply him looking at her, as if she had said something that opened a door he had forgotten was there. Before either of them could speak again, the sound of the terrace door changed, Lady Greta's voice moving closer, completing its strategic retreat. When Elara gathered the will and returned it to the poems in a smooth, practiced motion. Cian straightened in his chair, his expression closing back into its customary composure, but slowly, this time, as if the shutters were being drawn across rooms that had been aired rather than sealed. Penhaligon will be in touch within the week, he said, his voice returned to its formal register. Thank you. She meant it completely. For your father's friendship with mine, for your... She paused, finding the right word. Your clear sight. The corner of his mouth moved. That precursor again, that closed door with the light behind it. Miss Voss? He rose as his aunt appeared on the path. Will you be at the Aldric Music Hall next Thursday? Lady Greta hosts one each season. She has been known to invite families in the neighborhood. I don't know if Lady Mirabel will. My aunt will extend the invitation personally this afternoon. Something moved in his voice. Lady Mirabel will find it difficult to refuse. Lady Greta arrived at the table with all the cheerful energy of a woman who had spent 40 minutes conducting expert social warfare and found it invigorating. She beamed at Elara with the warmth of someone who has already made a decision and is delighted by it. What a charming garden, she said. The roses are remarkable. Cian, Aren't they remarkable?" "Extraordinary," the Duke said. He was looking at Elara, not the roses. He did not touch her hand when he left. He did not say anything that could not be reported back to Lady Mirabel without consequence. He was, in every observable way, a man conducting a polite morning call and departing correctly. But as the Aldric carriage moved down the drive, and Elara stood at the garden's edge watching it go, she had the strong, clear-sighted, completely inconvenient awareness that something was happening here that had nothing to do with the social fiction they were both carefully maintaining. She told herself it was gratitude, the legal help, the solicitor, the promise of her allowance restored. Those were things that changed everything, that meant a future was possible in ways it hadn't been 72 hours ago. It was natural to feel warmth toward the person who had seen the problem and offered to help fix it. Natural, understandable, and perfectly containable. She told herself this with great precision and clarity. She didn't believe a word of it. The Thursday musicale at Aldric House was everything Elara had been told to expect, and nothing she'd been prepared for. Lady Greta had, as promised, extended the invitation personally that very afternoon, appearing in Lady Mirabel's drawing room with the guileless certainty of a woman who expects doors to open before her and finds they always do. Lady Mirabel had received the invitation with a smile of such polished graciousness that Elara, watching from the corner where she had been cataloging the linen inventory, had felt a genuine flicker of admiration for the performance. She could not refuse. To refuse Lady Greta Aldric's personal invitation would be a social injury from which the family would take months to recover. And with Cecily's prospects still in play, with the Duke's interest still the primary object of Lady Mirabel's calculations, refusing would be extraordinary folly. So Elara came to the musicale. She came in a dress that was 2 seasons old but well pressed, her ruined hair pinned as cleverly as she could manage, her mother's pearl earrings, one of the few things Lady Mirabel had never bothered to take, small and quiet at her ears. She came prepared to be managed, to sit in the corner, to be invisible. She was not invisible. She was seated beside Lady Greta before she had been in the room 5 minutes. Lady Greta, who had apparently decided to make Elara her particular project, and was proceeding with the same focused cheerfulness she had brought to occupying Lady Mirabel 3 days ago. She asked Elara about the roses, about her mother, and about the Cowper poems. And here Elara looked up sharply, wondering if that was coincidence, and met Lady Greta's mild eyes, and understood it was not. She knew about the will. Elara looked across the room. The Duke was standing near the fireplace, speaking with a group of county gentlemen, his back partially toward her. But as if he felt her attention, he turned, and for one brief moment their eyes met across the warm, music-filled room. He inclined his head very slightly, a private acknowledgement in a public room. She looked away before anyone could notice. The music was beautiful, a soprano, accomplished and genuine, performing with the kind of commitment that Elara had always found more moving than perfection. She let the sound settle over her and tried not to be aware of exactly where the Duke was in the room, which was difficult because she seemed to have developed an involuntary sensitivity to his proximity, like a compass that has found north. "He watches you when you're not watching him," Lady Greta said serenely during a pause between pieces. "And you watch him when he isn't watching you. It's all very civilized and completely transparent." Elara kept her expression neutral. "I don't know what you mean, Lady Greta." "Of course you don't, dear. That's very well done." The older woman patted her hand. "My nephew has not been interested in anything outside of duty and grief for 3 years. He arrived at the Whitmore Ball prepared to conduct himself with appropriate efficiency and returned to London unchanged. He wrote me a letter from this house at 6 o'clock in the morning, which he has not done since his father was alive." She paused, on letting that settle. "He asked me to help him arrange a call. He described you as," she tilted her head slightly, as though consulting the letter in memory, "someone who sees things without flinching and who does not offer comfort as a substitute for truth." The soprano began again. Elara stared at her hands. "I'm not," she started and stopped. What she wanted to say was that she was not suitable, Not the kind of woman who entered this world, not the kind of match anyone would expect or approve or encourage. That Lady Mirabel was probably right, in her cold, calculating way, that a duke did not choose a penniless stepdaughter when there were better equipped options. That she had survived this long by being absolutely clear about what was real and what was wishful thinking. What she said instead was, "I don't want him to be hurt." Lady Greta was quiet for a moment, and when Elara finally looked at her, the older woman's expression had changed. The bright social armor had softened into something underneath it, something genuine and a little tired. "Neither do I," Lady Greta said. "He has been hurting for 3 years, quietly, with great competence, in a way that is going to kill something essential in him if it continues much longer. I have watched him do it, and I have not been able to stop it, and I love him more than almost anything in this world." She looked at Elara directly. "You made him write a letter at 6 in the morning. I don't know what you are to him yet. Perhaps he doesn't know either, but I am asking you very sincerely not to run from it before you find out." Across the room, the Duke had detached from the group of gentlemen and was moving through the gathering with the measured intention of someone navigating toward a specific destination. Lady Mirabel was at the far end of the room, engaged with the Whitmore matriarch. Cecily was beside a young viscount who seemed genuinely charmed by her, which was, Elara thought, perhaps the one good thing currently in motion. He arrived beside them with a cup of tea for Lady Greta and nothing in his hands for Elara, which meant his presence was explainable, and his attention was not. "The soprano is remarkable," he said, to neither of them in particular. "She is," Elara said. "She means it. You can hear the difference between someone who is performing correctly and someone who's actually feeling what the music requires." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. You can." And the word had nothing to do with the soprano. The evening moved on, and with it the careful circling dance of two people who were both very precise about the truth and very unwilling to say it aloud. They did not speak privately again. There was no opportunity, or the opportunity existed, and both of them chose not to take it, which was its own kind of answer. But twice she felt his gaze from across the room, and twice she let herself look back, and each time the look lasted a moment longer than it should have. Lady Mirabel departed early, citing Cecily's need for rest. Cecily, who was having the best evening she'd had all season, accepted this with visible reluctance. Elara followed without argument. She was almost at the door when she heard his voice. Miss Voss. Quiet, precise, meant only for her. She stopped, turned, but he was a few feet behind her, and in the doorway's half-light, his face was different again from every other version she had seen. Not the Duke at the ball, not the man at the garden table, not the controlled presence across a music-filled room. Something was present in his expression that had not been there before, that she did not have a word for yet. "Penhaligon wrote to Lady Mirabel's solicitor today," he said, keeping his voice low, below the noise of the departing crowd. "The allowance will be released within the month. The matter is proceeding." "Thank you," she said, "for all of it. There is something else." He paused, and something in the pause told her this was the thing he had been working toward. "My estate has been without a proper land manager for 6 months. The man who held the position retired. I have been managing it myself, between everything else, which is not ideal." He met her eyes. "I'm told you managed your father's accounts, that you have a precise understanding of land and tenancy and the particular arithmetic of a working estate." She was very still. "Yes. I am not offering charity. I am identifying a practical problem and a person who appears to be suited to solving it." His voice was even, careful, giving her nothing she hadn't earned. "The position would be housed at Raven Hollow. You would have your own quarters, a salary, and a professional arrangement that would remove you entirely from this house and Lady Mirabel's management." A pause. "I'm aware of how this may appear. I am asking you to disregard how it appears, and to consider only whether it is something you want." Elara looked at him in the doorway's light, this man who had seen her father in letters and recognized something in her that matched what the letters had described, who had read the will without being asked and sent for the solicitor that same day, who watched her when she wasn't watching and turned to look when she was. She thought of Lady Mirabel's voice that morning. It was a diversion. Men of his position do not marry diversions. She thought of her mother. Clarity is a form of courage, she thought. He is offering me a door out of the room I've been locked in for 2 years. And he is doing it in a way that gives me every dignity and nothing that costs me my independence. I would need to review the estate's accounts before accepting, she said. I won't take on a position I don't know I can do properly. The corner of his mouth moved, fully this time. A real smile, brief and slightly undone, as though it surprised even him. Of course, he said. I'll have them sent to you. She nodded and turned and walked out into the night where Lady Mirabel's carriage was waiting, where Cecily was already inside, wrapped in a shawl, where the ordinary machinery of her constrained life resumed as if nothing had changed. Everything had changed. She was sure of it in the same way she was sure of the will and the accounts and her mother's clear-eyed philosophy. Certain with the particular certainty of someone who has survived this long by refusing to mistake comfort for truth. Cian Aldric, Duke of Raven Hollow. Tact was not conducting a polite social intervention. He was not simply fulfilling a debt to her father's memory. He was doing what she was doing, moving carefully through the space between two people who were afraid to name what is building between them, conducting himself with precision and restraint, making sure each step was solid before the next one. She knew this because she recognized it. She was doing exactly the same thing. And somewhere between the rusted garden gate and the doorway of a musical room, what had begun as a chance encounter in the dark had become something she could not, in clear conscience, call accidental. She arrived at Raven Hollow on a Tuesday, with one trunk and her father's watch. The accounts were in order within a fortnight. The estate's tenants, who had spent 6 months being managed by a duke, stretched too thin between grief and duty, responded to her with the quiet gratitude of people who recognize, without being told, when someone actually sees them. Cian watched her work. He did not interfere. He simply began, gradually and without announcement, to be present in the same rooms she was in, the estate office in the mornings, the library in the evenings, the rose garden on the days when neither of them pretended they were there for any reason other than the same one. Lady Mirabel's letter arrived in the 3rd week. Threatening, calculated, the last move of a woman who had run out of board. He read it once, handed it to Penhaligon, and said, "Deal with it." Then he turned to Elara and said, "I love you. I have been working up to saying that since a garden in the dark, and I find I'm done waiting." She looked at him with her mother's clear eyes. "I know," she said. "I love you too." The roses were in full bloom. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.